we're going to talk about deep listening. And to do that, I want to share something kind of crazy with you. Did you know that fully 2/3 of American men would prefer to administer themselves a mild electric shock than to sit alone with their own thoughts for more than 6 minutes? And it's actually 25% of women would do the same thing. And I'm not making this up. This actually comes from a study that was done at UVA back in 2014. It was the culmination of 11 different experiments trying to figure out how do people relate to themselves, and what do they do when they're just left alone in a room with no stimulation. And it turns out if they have the option to shock themselves, they would rather do that, most of us, or many of us, than sit quietly just with our own thoughts. That's kind of amazing. But it in some ways, it's not necessarily that surprising, because many of us really aren't that good at deep listening. It's not something that we practice, even with ourselves. So what is deep listening? You could think of it as something that's rooted in genuine curiosity. So when we're deeply listening, we are really actually trying to find something out. It's a process of discovery. We're seeking understanding. So we're not just gathering information, we're also trying to understand the feelings, the motivations, the psychology behind whatever someone is sharing with us. And to do that, we actually have to step outside of our own psychology. We have to set aside our own frames and filters, our own way of looking at the world, and try to inhabit someone else's world. That's what deep listening really, really involves. And because of that, this is another reason why we often don't like to do it, or can even be afraid of doing it, is that when you engage in deep listening, you're opening yourself up to being moved by the other person. And there's some other fascinating research that if we are listening deeply to someone that we think we disagree with, it activates the same threat circuits in our amygdala as if we were being chased by a tiger. It's very primitive. We are afraid, actually, when we get into a listening mode with someone who has a different point of view about something that's really core to our identity. We become afraid, as if we have that same kind of fear, that fight or flight response gets triggered. And so there are all kinds of reasons why we might not want to listen deeply to others. And this also applies to ourselves, that one reason that people may rather kind of distract themselves, even with something negative like an electric shock, is just the fear of actually confronting ourselves. And I know that, and I've shared this story with you guys, that when I tried to start meditating, that's what would happen to me. That when I just sort of tried to clear my thoughts, what really happened is that inner voice just started speaking more loudly, and I didn't like what it was saying. And so I found that just very disquieting, and I had to find a different way around that to get into meditation. So why does deep listening matter so much? Well, there's a great book out there. It's actually called You're Not Listening, by Kate Murphy. And Kate Murphy's a journalist who did a whole lot of interviews. And she started noticing that the quality of her listening and sort of great interviewers like Terry Gross is just elevated to such a degree. It can really have a transformative, restorative power. And so she puts it like this: to listen well is to figure out what's on someone's mind and demonstrate that you care enough to want to know. It's what we all crave, to be understood as a person with thoughts, emotions, and intentions that are unique and valuable and deserving of attention. So at some level, deep listening is satisfying one of our deepest desires, which is to be heard. And it's a gift that you can give to yourself, you can give to those who are closest to you, and you can also, when you choose and when you feel able, you can give it to people with whom you disagree, as a means of trying to understand. So a couple reasons why this is so hard, why deep listening is so hard. And the first is really physiological. It's kind of funny, maybe God's joke on us, but human speech is about 125 words per minute. But our brains can process language much faster than that, about 800 words per minute. And that's why, for any of you, who have one of these, if you listen to audiobooks, have you ever noticed that you can listen to an audiobook at 3.5 times the normal speed? And if you've ever tried to do this, I don't necessarily recommend it. It sounds a little bit like the chipmunks, but you can actually understand it, and you can train your ear to follow that at 3.5 times normal speed. So what happens when we're in a conversation is it seems like someone is talking like this. Our brain has so much extra capacity that we have a psychological challenge, which is that we actively have to choose to quiet our own inner voice in order to devote our extra processing power to actually listening to the other person. And that's a choice we make because we have all this extra processing capacity in a normal conversation. What we choose to do with it is the key question. Do we choose to refocus that cognitive capacity on the other person and try to really hear what they're saying? Or do we invest it in daydreaming in our own kind of inner voice, which will often go off in tangents, and then before you know it, we've lost the thread even of the 125 words per minute that we thought we were tracking. And for those of us who think we can do both at the same time, there's lots of evidence that not only can we not do that, but also that other people can tell. Even when we think we are sort of saying, we're following along in the conversation, there are all these other subtle clues that the other person and you may not even be aware of, but subconsciously you both know that the full deep listening is not happening. So one of the ways to engage your system 2, your higher level faculties that would otherwise run off and stop listening, is actually with this deep curiosity, to really get curious about the wiring diagram, whether you're listening to yourself or you're listening to someone else. And you all may be familiar with this chart. This is kind of something that I've shared before. It's a model of our psychology as a system. And there's so much in here that you can dig into. But one way to really reinvest in deep listening is, as you're listening to someone else, be thinking, what is it that I'm hearing? How does this fit into their innate human drives? How they meet their needs for security, for novelty, for social status? What about their higher level drives for self-actualization? Am I hearing something about how they want to contribute to others, how they're evolving their self? Are they sharing an emotion that's like an automatic trigger? You can think of this whole tapestry, this whole system, and as you're listening, you can be trying to fill in a model in a way that can really reflect a deeper understanding of where they're coming from. What is their system of meaning that leads them from these universal human drives through their thoughts, their feelings, and ultimately their actions? So this is the first question. Are you listening deeply to yourself? And we know from that research that I shared with you earlier that many of us are not. Many of us, when we sit quietly by ourselves, would rather shock ourselves or do anything else than actually listen to that inner voice. So just some things to think about. What to listen for deeply in a kind and curious dialogue with yourself. And this is sort of an important thing to say. I think a lot of us are familiar with that inner voice, but it's important to say that inner voice, which is often critical of us, which often says things we don't want to hear, it can seem unkind. It's not actually you, right? Because you can hear it. So you stand apart from that inner voice. There is another part of your consciousness that's deeper and bigger than that inner voice. And so what's really going on when you are listening to yourself is actually a dialogue between what you could call your highest and best self and that inner voice. And there is tremendous opportunity for growth and understanding in making that inner dialogue more kind and more curious. And so there's some classic teaching from cognitive behavioral therapy about how you think about your state of mind. The cognitive behavioral therapy triangle is basically saying that your state of mind is determined by your thoughts, your feelings, and your behaviors. And if you change any one of the points of this triangle, you'll change the whole thing. So you can really be, as you are listening to your inner voice and sort of gently engaging that critical voice, you want to be asking, what is the relationship between my thoughts, my feelings, and my actions? And if I don't like the way I'm feeling right now, how could I change my thoughts or my actions in order to change my feelings? So that's one way to think about that inner dialogue and listening more deeply to yourself. There's lots of tools from cognitive behavioral therapy that really expand on that, but that's a core idea from cognitive behavioral therapy that's very valuable. And another really valuable, a lot of these ideas from CBT, or cognitive behavioral therapy, have been popularized through different lenses. Some of you may have heard of a book called The Work of Byron Katie. And she actually just sort of came up with this herself, but what she really did was independently derive some of the key principles of cognitive behavioral therapy. She came up with 4 questions that she used to question her own thinking and really liberate herself in a kind of a kind and curious dialogue with herself. And the first question, when she had a thought that she didn't feel good about, is this thought true? Is it true? Can you absolutely know that it's true? And how do you react? What happens when you believe that thought? And who would you be without that thought? Very simple questions. So that's a way to really elevate that dialogue within yourself, to listen deeply, not be afraid of that inner voice, not try to hide it, because I think we all know that when we try to tamp that voice down, it comes out louder and louder, whether it's waking us up at 4 a.m. or interrupting us and our peace of mind in other ways. And so a far better way to deal with that voice is actually to listen to it deeply with kindness and curiosity. Now, let's talk about listening deeply to the people you are closest to. And in the midst of this pandemic, the stress of this past election cycle, a lot of us have taken refuge on literal and metaphorical islands. We are in bubbles. We are isolated, with sometimes just on our own, but often with family members or other people that we're close to. And in many ways, there's an epidemic of bad listening going on our islands. And what is more tragic than seeking refuge in a way and being physically close to people where you're not actually engaged in a deep understanding and deep listening? That can be a very lonely feeling. And so what I would challenge all of us to do is to step up our listening to those that we are closest to. And this is a little, zoom in on that model of our psychology, and things to listen for or questions to ask others. What would make this an extraordinary conversation for you? It's sort of a bold question to ask, but what if you sat down with someone you're close to and just use that as a conversation opener? They might say, what? But you'd be quite striking where that question would take you. What is your greatest source of joy? What greater good is trying to happen through you? Where are you feeling most stuck? So if you kind of begin these questions at sort of people's higher selves, and you're trying to understand how the people you're closest to, what are they trying to be? What are they trying to become? And what's getting in their way? And what would their highest and best self say about that? What do they already know they can do to help themselves? So a lot of these are questions that if you've ever worked with a coach, you may hear from a coach, because the whole modality of coaching is really about listening. It's about deep listening, creating a space for you to be heard and to share a lot of times what you already know you need to do. So that's another lens here, is just to think about the people you're on the island with and how can you step up your listening with those people that you're already close to. But what about the fact that there seems to be so much that divides us now as a country, as a people? Are you listening deeply to build bridges across difference? And what does that even look like? Well, here we might want to start in a sort of a different place within that psychological model by listening for the emotional triggers for fear, anger, insecurity, disconnection. The words like less, loss, and never. Tony Robbins has this famous saying that, anytime you hear someone talking about having less, about losing something, about never being able to do something, you hone in on that to really understand the negative fears and anger that may be driving them in their own life and their own motivation. And so beginning when you feel a difference with someone, when you're struggling to understand how could they think that way, begin by trying to understand what they are afraid of, what they're angry about, where they feel insecure and disconnected, and doing it with a sense of curiosity and compassion. And then moving on to the higher level aspirations they might have. How do they want to contribute to others? How do they want to learn and grow? And then listening for the wiring diagram. How are they're connecting these ideas of their thoughts and their feelings, and then pulling back out to the big picture. How does it all add up into a way of looking at the world and a consistent pattern of action? So there's no magic in this, but it really is true that understanding comes from deep listening. And the fact that so many of us don't practice deep listening with ourselves, that we struggle to practice it with those we are closest to, means it's that much more challenging for us to listen deeply across difference. But we're at a point in our country's history where we've never needed more to listen across difference. And so I really urge all of you to reflect on how you can step up your own listening, beginning with yourself and maybe beginning with those you're closest to, and then experimenting with how you can use listening to bridge across difference. Because when we do that, we're really opening ourselves up for more joy and more impact across all the areas of our lives. If you like this video and you want to access the worksheet or any other material that goes with it, just click the link below or head on over to joyfulimpact.co. That's the website where we have all the material we use for working with coaching and personal development for change agents. You can set up a free account in the members area, and you can also check out the blog where we have new content coming out all the time. Why are we putting all this out there for free? Because the world has never been more in need of a new greatest generation of change agents. I hope this material is helpful to you, and if it is, please like the video, subscribe to the channel. That will help us spread the word.